Our discussion is on participatory cities for regeneration. We have a really excellent discussion panel for you over the next hour or so, and you're very welcome to join and sit in and listen to our discussion. We invite you to say hello in the chat and to post questions as we go along. This is a discussion event which is part of a series, and we are running a theme from the London Hub, which is system innovation for cities, and we're hosting a number of events through March and April. If you'd like to see more information about those events, you can check on our website as well. We have a fantastic panel with us today. I will introduce those very shortly. They all have different experience leading participatory work in cities. And we had a quick catch up yesterday, and I know today's discussion is going to be really, really interesting. So just a quick bit of housekeeping. We are going to have a discussion for about an hour now, between 5 and 6. And we will have about 15 minutes at the end for Q&A. So please do ask questions in the chat as we go along, and we'll maybe pick up some of those as we go, or save those to the end. We are live streaming on YouTube as well, where you'll be able to watch via YouTube if you prefer, and add comments, and also watch that recording back. Just setting a little bit of context for the discussion today around participatory cities and regeneration. We thought it'd be useful just to say a few words around that topic. So I'm sure we're all here because we're all very interested in this topic of systems change and finding better ways and better practices around achieving systems change. And we know that systems change is all about changing the paradigm and the structure within the system in order to realize new outcomes. And one of the key structural changes is about moving from a centralized model to a more decentralized model, a different way of organizing ourselves from the kind of industrial age of centralization to the post-industrialization age of a decentralized model. A participatory city is an approach to urban development and the creation of a city space which aims to engage those people within the city in the co-creation of the systems that they are part of every day. So it's a really super interesting idea. It's a really powerful idea. It's being practiced around the world, and we have speakers with us today to talk to us about their experiences of leading participatory models. Some of the questions we may get into is there a different way of organizing public services from being very centralized to decentralized? How can we best harness and engage the creative capabilities of people who live in places, of the local communities and the local people who make up those places? And how can we empower those people and those local communities to take on more responsibility in the co-creation of services and the spaces they're part of? So it's going to be a really super interesting topic, and I'll now introduce our panel very quickly. So we have Nat Deferring. Nat is the interim chief executive at Participatory City Foundation. We have Karina Angelou, is principal design strategist at Forum for the Future and a PhD candidate in urban resilience at Imperial College. We have Elisa Massaratini, who is an architect and urban planner. She is the co-founder of Apprezzo Internazioni Urbane. I think I said that right. Welcome to you all. Thank you very much for joining us. Just to kick things off, it would be great to hear a few opening thoughts about your relationship with the topic of participation in cities and to why you think it's a really important topic. So perhaps we can start with Matt, move over to Karina, and then Elisa.
Thanks very much, James, and really exciting to be here as part of this discussion. As James said, I run an organisation called Participatory Cities Foundation, so this feels very much like a conversation we should be part of. So I'm delighted to be here this evening. Just really quickly, some opening thoughts on what James has asked us to cover. I mean, from my own personal journey to get to here, sitting here today, is that I started life many years ago as a probation officer, and so for those who don't know what that is, that's a practitioner working in the criminal justice system. I was dealing with working with people for whom systems, society had already failed them in any number of respects. For each case that I was working with, represented a life which had already fallen through every single net that exists, and by the time people end up in the criminal justice system, so much damage has been done, not only by the person to society, but also by society to the person, that it's incredibly challenging to think about how actually a life can be turned around. So that's why the topic of prevention and thinking about how you might think about a different, the other thing obviously about these types of systems is they're expensive. All the damage has already happened, so you're spending a lot of money, both in terms of actual money, but also in terms of the emotional and human damage which is caused to deal with problems once all the harm has happened. Over time and through various different routes, I began to be much more interested in what a preventative system looks like. And one of the really sort of significant insights I developed over time, I think, from my work, was that this idea of exclusion inequality, people feeling like they have no agency, that they don't have a stake, this sort of, which I think a concept which is summed up in the concept of social capital. People with very little social capital tend to be the ones who end up in these systems at the end of a sort of terrible story of damage that has been done. And via some really interesting time, I'm delighted to see on the screen right now my former colleague Monica Nagore, with whom I worked at the Young Foundation. And Monica and I, well, we will reminisce about this some other time, but we did lots of really interesting work about social innovation, which was the idea that you need to understand communities and then use those insights to generate new ideas. And amazing stuff is done through that work. But I equally found that it was when we ran accelerators and incubators at the Young Foundation, that it tended to be a certain type of person who was able to benefit from those sorts of opportunities. Again, amazing people. I'm not here to do down the work of social innovation. I think it's incredible. But you do tend to see people who are bright-eyed, bushy-tailed, well-networked, confident, resilient, who tend to be able to develop and advance social innovations. For me, the concept of participation is much broader, much more profound, much deeper than anything that any service can touch, anything that social innovation, in my experience, has been able to touch. And it's about, for me, the participatory city is one where there's a huge diversity of opportunities to participate. I'm sure this evening we're going to talk about different forms of participation applied to democracy and budgets and planning and all sorts of different things. All really, really important. But I also think that the idea of cities becoming places, systems where people, residents, can actually get involved through their ingenuity, their creativity, their connections with one another. Environments really where participation is possible, I find hugely, hugely exciting. And I think it creates, for me, it is the concept which I've found in my career, which genuinely has the promise of this sort of preventative system, which can prevent some of these terrible things from materializing in the future. So I believe passionately in it. I'm delighted to be part of this conversation, and I look forward to where we go today.
Amazing. Thank you, Nat. Yeah, it's great to hear your passion for the subject as well. And absolutely, we'll get into those topics of community resilience and capacity building and things like that as well. So Karina, maybe give us a bit of a flavour for your background in the participation for cities as well.
Yeah, definitely. Lovely to be here. Lovely to see you all. My sort of journey started a bit differently. So I grew up in a city that was very much not participatory, and I was kind of growing up in Bucharest, in Romania, with the consequences of socialist planning, very, very centralized urban design, very centralized urban development, I was kind of, as an aspiring architect as I was growing up, I was kind of wondering, what could we do differently? What does architecture and urban planning for a 21st century look like? So I trained as an architect, and then my first job in architecture was actually for an office in Germany that was specializing in ways to bring in participation in educational buildings. So they were focusing on schools, on campuses, on university buildings, but very much looking to center the experiences of students in the design process. And to me, that was really transformative. So really kind of, also as a first role in architecture, it was very much almost like a different outlook to what cities could look like, and also what the process of city making could look like. And it was, we were involving kids and students as young as 4 years old, and as old as mature students, coming with very, very different needs, but seeking to use the same spaces, and also looking at this integrated development. So how do we support lifelong learning, for example? What does education look like? How do we create spaces that are not just for young children, but also spaces that cater for the wider community, spaces that cater for the parents, for the carers, spaces that really invite a social life as well, especially as schools and educational buildings are a lot of the time a sort of community hub wherever they might be. So yeah, that was quite a transformative approach. And then I kind of moved away from architecture, but I think to me that was almost kind of a foundational experience around how do we redesign the material, but also the immaterial artifacts, objects, buildings, but also processes and governance mechanisms to actually enable us to bring different experiences, different worldviews, different priorities, and to really have a conversation about how we negotiate between these, because different people have very different needs, especially in cities. So yeah, I'll leave it there for now, but I'm sure we're gonna dive a lot deeper into this. But lovely to be here with you today.
Amazing. Thank you, Karina. And Elisa, over to you.
Hello, thank you very much for this, for inviting me. So me too, I grew up in a place that lacked a little bit of action and change, because I'm from Rome, Italy. So it's a very conservatory city and historical city. So transformation is something very far from our culture. And so my career also in architecture was always trying to put innovation in action. So for me, my experience is in 2 different levels, because I work with an NGO that I founded, Interazioni Urbane, who means urban interaction, just to build interaction in the city with the main objective for me is to do, and for our organization is to transform space, so to put urban regeneration at the top, but doing mainly social innovation. So participatory planning for me in this part of my life is a tool to engage people in urban transformation and transform their lives. So to improve their participatory approach to the city, the culture of common good, but also to work with the people with depression, disability, so to support also social inclusion of minorities. The other part of my life is in the consultancy sector. So I work as urban planner. I did a PhD on urban regeneration, working on slums in Latin America. So from Italy, I'm in Europe, I moved to Latin America, and I learned a lot in Latin America about participatory planning. Then I came back and I tried to apply this culture of community and co-design in Europe. so with my organization, with the placemaking mainly projects, public parks, regeneration, engaging at the neighborhood scales people. And then in the consultancy part of my life, I work mainly in African secondary cities, and I try to apply participatory planning in the master planning processes, so in the big infrastructure projects. That's a complete different scale, complete different challenges of participation, because I normally act in very conservatory and vertical, not so democratic context, and participation, it deals with governance, as you say, that deals with politics and with culture. So for me, it's a mission to build this connection between urban planning, urban development, and community participation, because in each country I traveled and I worked, there is not still a culture of that. I think it's very different, the reality of England and from my reality in Rome and the reality of Latin America and reality of Africa. So maybe it might support this discussion. My approach will be more from the South vision. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Lisa. Yeah, the cultural aspect is certainly something I'm sure we'll explore. Just going over to Nat. So I know Participatory Cities, the foundation, has spent a number of years working in a particular area in London. I was quite interested if you could explain to us a few of the projects or approaches that you put out there in that area in London to encourage communities to act and to kind of utilize their talent and creative ideas. So kind of like how do you start in a community? What are some of the projects you might look to do? Yeah,
just a really quick bit of background behind what we're doing so I work in a place in the east of London called Barking and Dagenham, which is an amazing place. I could spend the whole evening talking about Barking and Dagenham, but I won't do that. And the particular type of participation the particular part of the participation system that we're focused on is something quite specific. So there are different, as I sort of said earlier, as I'm sure many of you will be thinking about in your own lives and work. Participation has an application in all sorts of different parts of our lives. We sort of envisage that there is if you're a resident of a place, of a community, there already exist a number of different models really for how you can have influence, use your agency to influence how your neighborhood develops, what your community is, how your life develops indeed. Many of these systems are well established, they're well understood. So, local representative democracy is one. In the UK, the charitable model is very well understood and established, and there's infrastructure that exists to help you set up a charity if you want to do that. There's very well established systems and structures around enterprise, social enterprise, going back to the work I used to do to support people to develop social innovation. That exists and is increasingly well understood. So these models exist. And if you're a resident with something that you want to achieve for your community, you can use one of these models to make that happen. But the thing we're interested in is a different type of participation. And our research prior to getting to Barking and Dagenham in London identified and sort of described this different thing. And this was we call it peer-to-peer participation. Very often very practical and useful in nature. And it really describes the sorts of things which happen when residents connect with one another around shared interests, shared aims, shared aspirations, really. Everyone has a contribution to make. It brings people together in a very inclusive and equal way. It's not about experts doing things on behalf of communities. It's not about services delivering on behalf of beneficiaries. It's not about someone buying something from someone else. And having identified this thing, we began to be very interested in why there isn't a system around that sort of stuff. These projects exist, but if you go and find these projects around the world, very typically what has to happen is they have to convert to something else. They need to find a business model. They need to apply for grant funding. They need to do all sorts of different things to survive. And most people in our communities don't have the time. Their lives are too busy, and in any case, in doing these things, you get drawn into all sorts of stuff that isn't fundamentally what you're trying to achieve. You end up worrying about governance and bank accounts and reporting and all the rest of it, which is actually nothing to do, all tangential to the work that you really care about, which might be making that space out the back of your on the street corner green, and and growing food for the local neighborhood or whatever it might be. So we're interested in what a system looks like, sort of infrastructure looks like at scale in a place which can make projects like that incredibly easy to do. And the reason we do it, which I hope goes back to what I said at the beginning, is not because it's nice and enjoyable stuff. It is that as well. It can be that as well, but it's also because this type of participation is incredibly impactful for people. We know that this type of connection with your neighborhood, connection with your neighbors, use application of your own skills, seeing your local community change because of your actions and that you've achieved with your neighbors is transformative for people. It improves their health, it improves their sense of trust, it improves their lives of their children, it enables learning, all sorts of things that are achieved through this model. But they're achieved by very small scale acts of participation accumulating in a very sort of intensive way in a place and over time. So we're building a system which is about making that incredibly easy. In answer to your question, James, what are the examples of projects? Well, this is one of the really fantastic things, I think. Talk about innovation, but the innovation is not in the projects themselves. The things that if you create these, this is what we're finding in Barking Dagenham, if you make these opportunities possible for people, if you give them the resources and the tools they need to act on the basis of their own ideas and ingenuity, the things which they create are really straightforward. Often they're straightforward, simple, common denominator projects. They're about growing, they're about greening, they're about making, they're about sharing skills, they're about setting up community, setting up opportunities to cook and eat together. They're about transforming little bits of green space. There's nothing innovative in them, but they are incredibly useful and they make a real difference. The innovation, I would argue, is in the system that we're trying to build around those that infrastructure. So, as I say, the types of projects that residents are building in Barking Dagenham are just there's multiple versions of what I've just described. Loads of different, all sorts of pockets of the borough. Residents are greening and growing and cooking and making and sharing skills with one another and upcycling and doing all these things which already exist. But there's a system which makes it incredibly easy to create those things in a place.
Yeah, super interesting that. And I guess, would you describe it almost as sort of a platform for community self-organization and something like that?
Yes, I saw a comment about ABCD, and I think there's a difference. This is getting possibly slightly. Tell me if I'm getting boring, but this is not about creating something and then letting residents get on with it. And the reason for that is because, and this is because if you do that sort of thing, this is my experience from working on social innovation at the Young Foundation, including in other places, it tends to be the same sorts of people, it's the same groups in our communities who end up doing all the stuff because they're these amazing people. So much amazing stuff happens because of these people, but they do tend to be highly resilient, well connected, and all the other things that makes them really extraordinary. The vast majority of people aren't like that, I would argue. There's some evidence behind that, incidentally. And so what we're trying to create is a zone, if you like, between an organization or an institution like the one I run and residents sort of in their ordinary everyday lives, where the platform can sort of rise up to meet the needs of any individual project or activity. So we try and create as much space as possible for residents to build stuff and create stuff together. But where they can't, because they don't have the time, or they don't know how to do a particular element of it, well, then the platform can actually come in and make that thing happen. So the project isn't the specific project, the individual project doesn't rely on any individual resident. The resident isn't on the hook for making that project a success or otherwise. It's a shared endeavor with the platform. So it's a different zone, different space that we're looking to create. Yeah. It's the sort of co-design idea, really.
Fantastic. Thank you, Nat. Just interested to get Karina's thoughts on there, because I know, Karina, you're very interested in urban resilience and how participation can be used to develop urban resilience, and perhaps you'd like to comment on that in regards to what Nat said as well.
Yeah, definitely. I think one sort of immediate takeaway is that kind of platform at scale would be amazing to have, and I'm sure that many places would really benefit from learning from these approaches, but also looking at what does this mean for different urban challenges. I think in the work in the work line that I'm in around climate change adaptation and urban resilience, so really looking at how do we adapt our cities, our urban systems to be able to respond to the increasing effects of climate change, I think it's really tricky because of multiple reasons. On the one hand, you have challenges around the statutory duty that actually municipalities have and hold, and the extent to which you can make things participatory by law or not. But also on the other hand, because I think climate change, because of the uneven effects, I think it a lot of the times what we're seeing at the moment is that actually places and geographies that have had no sort of contribution to these extreme weather events, to hurricanes, to increasing sea level rises, they're actually really at the forefront of these issues. So when we talk about different countries, so for example, like one of the flagship case studies in our community is around the Bangladesh climate adaptation, and actually it's next level in terms of the challenges that you're facing in terms of the sea level rise, but also in terms of the urban challenges that Dhaka as a mega metropolis is facing in terms of being almost like at the limit of its coping capacity in terms of just basic urban services. So how do we bring in participation? And I think this is actually a key process around decision making, around governance, around how do you involve people, especially as climate change adaptation is starting to pose us with quite difficult conversations around what do we protect? Do we actually abandon some places? Do we support people to relocate? And if so, which people and when? And also what happens when the people who have to relocate because of climate change, what happens when their identity and their livelihoods was actually connected to that place? So it's not as easy to say coastal communities move inland, because a lot of coastal communities, their cultural and their identity is derived from their geography. So moving communities of fishermen, moving communities of people who have for centuries relied on this symbiotic relationship with the water, with the ocean, is actually deeply damaging. And I think that's where we're having like quite difficult conversations around how do you bring in participation, but very much with the social justice lens and very much with the climate justice lens. So it's almost like not just saying participation as a way of taking part and co-creating, but also about discussing and making decisions about these very difficult trade-offs that are actually, we're increasingly facing these trade-offs in many places. As and for those of you based in the UK, I think this is also a very live conversation in many Welsh communities, for example, in terms of what do you do with that geography when you've got the water moving in, but actually you're living next to mountains and your living space is actually diminishing by quite a lot. So I'll stop here. I know there's a lot more to kind of expand on.
Yeah, thanks, Karina. It's really interesting, the point you're making about the just transition and the role of participation in that as well. And I think one thing that'd be really interesting for us to talk a little bit about is that the kind of cultural elements of the participation, and how do we address also the challenges of existing power structures within cities and policymakers and urban planners, and encourage them to adopt participatory strategies and methods. And I wonder, Elisa, if you might have some thoughts on that to add.
Okay, thank you, James. This is a challenge because it's not so common that it's part of the cultural approach of urban planning. So I think we have to consider participation and community engagement as part of the decision-making process that is part of the urban planning approach and the urban planning tools. But for that, you need to have both the practitioner, the urban planner, the engineers, so the team of experts, and the governance sector, so the decision part engaged in participation. So for me, the starting point is to build a culture of participation that is not so easy. So it's important to build a culture of dialogue and a culture of listening, because participation means also facilitate a discussion, means an effort of listening the different stakeholders. And this is something tough, it's difficult, it's demanding. And so it's easier for me as urban planner, do my work alone at the office and not understand or listen the others. So it's the challenge for me. It's also to build a culture in practice of participatory approach in urban planning. So this has to be part also of the educational process. So I think it's important to put it in the academy process, in the architecture career, urban planning career, engineering career. So it's building a culture of participation before anything. Thanks.
I wonder if Nat, you could offer some thoughts on this, because clearly embarking in Dagenham in London, you've been working with the local authority for a long time. So I wonder your experiences of working with those existing power structures and any changes you've seen over that time.
Yeah, I think that once you're thinking about the things at the system level, it really one of the sort of fairly obvious things to say is that systems need to work together. They need to complement one another. They need to strengthen one another. And there's a lot of examples. Again, I'm sure we're all familiar with these, where systems work, get in each other's way and actually cause. I mean, again, harking back to my experience in the criminal justice system it's just extraordinary, because you had a number of systems that had obviously failed in quite profound ways in relation to people, but individuals. But you also had some really obvious examples where one system, in my experience, the police system, for example, was completely working. There was this very famous example in the UK where the police had a particular target around one thing which worked in complete opposition to the aims of the criminal justice system, the youth justice system that I was working in. So you had two systems at the heart of communities, both ostensibly trying to do the same thing, but they were pulling, the one was working in a way which completely undermined the aims of the other. So there's some famous examples of systems being completely wrong, getting this completely wrong. In Barking Dagenham, there's no way we could do our work. We couldn't we couldn't work at the system level. We couldn't do we couldn't enable projects to happen for residents in the way that we do, without there being a really, really profound set of relationships with not just the local council, but also with other systems as well. And to take some practical examples, lots of the things that residents want to do, typically they come up against obstacle after obstacle after obstacle. It can be the things I've already described, like having to apply for grants, or having to set up bank accounts, or having to deal with governance. But it can also be much more sort of much smaller scale things, like access to a street, being able to close a street off so that they can run a community project there, or access to a green space, or whatever it might be, access to a room, even just to run a session or an event. And so some of those problems can be solved on behalf of residents, so it doesn't appear as an obstacle in the way of residents trying to get the stuff done that they want to get. And that's one of the things that we're trying to do, in addition to this sort of co-design space we hold with residents to make projects happen. We're also trying to build relationships at the institutional organizational level to both clear the pathway, but also identify opportunities for residents to, and these can relate from things like I've just described to slightly more strategic things like test trading opportunities across the borough for cooperative businesses, which we're developing through the participation space. So it can range from the sort of small scale, very project focused, to the much larger scale as well. And I think a relationship between traditional parts of our sort of civic system, like the local authority, and non-traditional parts, I would describe us as a non-traditional part of the civic infrastructure, that these are really, really important. And in fact, I'd go as far as to say they'd be impossible without there being good relationships.
Thanks for that. Just thinking a little bit about the role of participation in urban renewal, urban regeneration, urban resilience, and there's a few questions I've seen on the chat, and maybe hand this over to Karina to comment on the role of participation as a tool for enabling greater adaptive capacity within cities. What are your thoughts on that?
What a question. I'll do my best to tackle this. It's a huge question, and I think it kind of goes to the heart of many of our challenges in society around like how we make decisions and how we come together. And I think these questions around how we organize are really fundamental, especially given that there's so many different schools of thought around, do we need to go fast and therefore go alone? There's very much, even in like the climate space, there's this school of thought that kind of says, we don't have time for participation. We just need to do it because we have the solutions. We need to scale them and we need to just fix it. Or do you say, well, actually, how we get there is a key part of actually enabling justice, enabling just transitions, and we need to carefully think about the process by which we get together and create solutions and implement solutions, because without that there is no sort of just and equitable future. So I think these are almost like two views that I see quite a lot in the climate space. They're not necessarily conflicting. I think sometimes you also need to kind of say, right, we've got the right technologies, we know how to scale them, we know where to deploy them. But then I think this key question around how do we bring people together, and especially some of the questions that are coming up around equity, around navigating different values, like these are questions where actually we do lack real processes. And I think what's been quite interesting, to give an example of this from my work, so in 2020, 2021, I had the pleasure to support the Scottish Climate Assembly in looking at how do we bring in imagination, how do we explore trade-offs, and how do we make decisions, and how do we prioritize interventions. And the process that I helped design was very much looking at, what is the role of design in this as well? How do we depict alternative visions, and how do we help people see the difference, whether it's the difference in who is driving the change in that scenario, in that imagined future, but also see the differences between almost the winners and the losers in that scenario. So we developed a series of immersive scenarios that were set in the future. They were all about, I'll link them in the chat, and they were very simple. They were like 1:30, 4 sketches, a very rapid process. And I think that was also quite interesting, that actually, a lot of the times scenario processes can be very, very long, but actually in this one, we almost kind of took a very sort of speculative design approach, almost to kind of say, what are the key dimensions, and how do we bring to life some of these trade-offs between what the climate assembly participants were actually looking very much at domain-based issues. So they were looking at food, they were looking at transport, they were looking at housing, but actually there was no space in the climate assembly to actually take a holistic view and kind of say, but what does it mean to live, if these interventions are brought to life? What is the quality of life? How do we interact? What do we have for breakfast? So quite, almost kind of bringing it back to the human scale. And what was really interesting was that actually seeing these different stories, we had very, very emotional responses in them. And I think when we have participatory processes, sometimes we almost kind of think that we only engage with our intellect, that it's all almost kind of like a cognitive experience. But I think what was really beautiful to me and a bit nerve-wracking to the organizers was this emotional response, like actually the embodied, it's very different when I can think about myself in this scenario and think about the implications, if we take gig economy and some of the things that we're seeing to an extreme. But actually seeing that emotional response, I think, is really important, because that's how we start seeing, well, what does this mean in terms of what we value, like what is that, almost like that gut response, what is that telling us about what's important? Anyway, I'll link to the stories. They're very short, they're 1 minute 30, but they'll give you a bit of a flavor as to how do we kind of bring in prompts, how do we deploy design, but also how do we help people in these like quite large processes like climate assemblies to actually navigate what is a lot of facts and a lot of data, which is also overwhelming if you're then trying to prioritize.
It's really interesting. You're talking about the sort of emotional connection and response that people have within their communities. And I'm just wondering if either Elisa or Nat have examples of maybe bringing in kind of the creative sector or creative groups within communities to kind of utilize art and more kind of emotive responses, rather than looking at, say, sort of applying documentations and data and stuff. And if you've seen any interesting approaches in your work around how you would utilize art within these examples.
Okay, thanks, James. Yes, no, in fact, creativity is the main tool we use. So we use art, we use emotional intelligence, we use empathy, we use any kind of emotional contact you can do through arts and to create this dialogue. And this is very, very strong. And I think it's the base at any scale, any kind of scale. And so, for example, now just to give you this year, we are working in 3 outskirts of Rome with our NGO, and we are working with a college, with a young, so 12, 13 years, discussing with them about urban regeneration 1 time a week and implicating them in a regenerating process of a public space. So they are working next week, they will work 20 children with us. And this is for us in transforming a public space in very, very bad outskirts of Rome. So this is a way through arts and through upcycling. We are creating still a circular economy around this intervention. So taking elders, taking the commerce, taking all the neighborhood around these small projects. But at the same time, you can create a culture of participation, a culture of regeneration with children. So they will be the activists of the future. So because for us, it's very important to start from the beginning and at the same time to demonstrate the people that we can do it. So it's also something about trust for me, because in my culture, in Italy, for example, but this is the same in other countries I work at, there is a lack of trust in institution, a lack of trust in urban planners, a lack of trust in architects. So for give you an example, in Italy, an architect is somebody that has to renovate your home. And maybe it's somebody that the power, the social engagement of also this kind, urban regeneration. it's from also responsibility, as you said. So we have to restart and redesign also the profile of our career. Thanks.
Yeah, really interesting. I think when we were talking yesterday, between say Nat and Elisa, you guys maybe have different timescales when you're working with projects as well. I was thinking about building that culture of participation, and Elisa, you're sort of saying the importance of starting or including the younger generation as well, and trying to influence local schools and younger people, and sort of embedding these principles of participation in the local areas as well. And I was wondering, Elisa, if maybe you could talk a little bit about a bit more about some of your successes or challenges in doing that, and whether those projects which are more kind of time bound are more challenging.
Yes, exactly. Sorry, also, so from architecture to more of a facilitatory. Yes, exactly. We have to move to facilitation. So to include the facilitatory approach in our projects and our process, and time. It's also a concern, because as Corina was saying, participation, it's a process. So we need also to take the time to listen, to create a connection, to create empathy. And sometimes there is no time. So you have to stretch processes and to find a way. Creativity is a tool, because with creativity, you can create a very fast connection. So if we design together, if we do something in concrete, practical together, we create a connection that many words can't create. We work, for example, with people with disability, with refugees, with a lot of women that are not used to participate in the decision-making process, but through the creation of this kind of creative space, start to interact, and then to speak, and then to participate, and then to have a voice. So I think it's very important to use participation as a tool, also to cut time and to include diversity.
Yeah, that diversity point is there's quite a few questions in the chat around that. And I wonder, Corina and Nat, if you have thoughts, comments to add in. How do we, achieve participation, widely, and sort of not restricted participation from only those who can afford to participate, but sort of more genuine and broader participation.
I'm happy to make a contribution to that. So I think, again, going back to what we are trying to build in Barking Dagenham, it's both very, very broad, but also quite specific. The type of thing, the system we're building, is designed to create inclusive, peer-to-peer, sort of practical participation opportunities. And probably maybe an easier way of understanding what it is by sort of just saying a few things about what it isn't. So it isn't a model for targeted approaches or targeted models that are focused on specific parts of the community. So we don't work with particular religious groups, or we don't work with particular models that are targeted at a very specific need. Just take one example. It might be a model which is about diverting children from the criminal justice system, just to take one that's familiar to me. Those things are really important. They need to exist, but it's not what we exist to create. We're looking to create, to design projects with residents that sit in this common denominator space where anyone can participate. We're looking to design them, infuse them with a set of design principles, inclusivity principles, that mean that the broadest possible group of people can participate, because that's how the outcomes through our model are achieved. What that means for inclusivity and diversity is that we're trying to find that sort of that common space where communities have shared aims, shared objectives. Everyone can bring something. Everyone's contribution is valued. Perhaps sounds a bit sort of utopian, but these models do exist. There are some things, you know, everyone has skills to share, everyone needs to learn something new, everyone wants to eat, everyone wants to learn something new about, you know, food is important to everyone. Access to green spaces and what we do on green spaces is important to everyone. Children are important in every single community. There are these opportunities for this common denominator space, and what we're trying to do is find that space and then build projects within that space. So I think, yeah, it's a weird answer to that question. How do you ensure that projects are you know, cater for specific needs or are accessible for specific parts of the community? Well, it's by making sure that they don't cater for specific needs and they don't cater for specific parts of the community. They're designed for everyone and in order for everyone to be able to participate. So it's a bit of a yes, it's a bit of a it sounds like I'm trying to avoid the question. I hope that didn't come across like that.
Not at all. Karina, do you have thoughts to add to that?
Yeah, I guess what I would add from the perspective of climate adaptation, I think the current conversation around diversity and inclusion is very much looking at how do we center the experiences of those who are most vulnerable, and not just in terms of almost kind of like sharing their experiences or sharing their insights, but also how do we build their capacities in terms of decision making, in terms of negotiation, in terms of brokering, in terms of like all of these skills that actually, if you're you know, a resident in a community that is vulnerable because of, you know, flooding or whatever, you might not have the skills to actually to even know who is responsible for your neighborhood being flooded, and therefore who do you hold to account. And I think there is a danger of putting too much on communities that are already experiencing the burden of climate change. So I'm now just talking about climate adaptation and resilience, right? This might not be applicable to many other contexts. But I think there's that question around how do you build capacity and what are the intermediary organizations, a bit like the Participatory City Foundation, that can actually take some of that burden on behalf of those communities and actually say, well, there is a duty for someone to actually look at how do you support these communities to learn how to negotiate or how to broker or how to write their demands or how to petition or how to go to a meeting with the municipality and voice their claims or their needs. So this process, I think, is really important. And I think this focus on vulnerability is quite key in terms of climate, to really kind of understand also what are the multiple drivers of vulnerability, because a lot of the times these are also socioeconomic and they're also predeterminants, right? So like if we think of health, there's a lot of you know, there's a lot of research that shows that that a lot of that is predetermined by socioeconomics. So I think there's acknowledging this, but then bringing this into that decision-making process to kind of understand, right, who are the right stakeholders? Because I think there's this danger of kind of saying inclusivity equals everyone, and actually that's not necessarily the case. So I think we need to be very choiceful about who do we design processes for and why, because there is also the other side, the flip side, that there's a lot of participation fatigue. So if you have a lot of, you know, and there's a running joke in climate adaptation where there's some communities that have literally been over researched because they have been used and treated as research subjects and not actually empowered to kind of to make a meaningful contribution and to actually take these issues forward. And I think there's a lot of fatigue, and ethically, I think you know, as a professional, as a practitioner, I would personally feel very uncomfortable to kind of say, right, you tell us what we need to do. Well, actually, I have a duty as a professional expert to support you in that process and to make sure that we think about the positionality of the facilitator. You know, I saw there was a comment earlier on about the power dynamics. And I think there's the danger that you do sometimes have facilitators that actually end up taking up all the space in the process. So I think it's navigating this, and I think is really important also for facilitators to be properly trained, to really understand anti-racism, to really understand the consequences of their own positionality and how they see the world, So I think there's all of these things that, to be honest, I think it's also just good ethical practice. But I think, yeah, there's a huge upskilling process that needs to happen. So I think my takeaway would be that inclusivity does not mean everyone, which is, you know, I don't know if that's maybe obvious. I'm sorry if it is, but it's, yeah, that's my experience.
Yeah, very good. Elisa, I don't know if you want to add to that as well. I'm just thinking as well, if you might have examples of how do you incentivize or reward people for doing participation, and whether there's also ways of kind of reducing the barriers to participation in certain projects as well.
Yeah, thank you, James. No, I totally agree with Corina about the selection of stakeholders to participation, because participation could be also dangerous if it's not well managed. But in terms of engaging people, it's not so easy. Sometimes you have to pay people, in my experience also, okay? So the identification of the citizen and the leaders, and so the main stakeholder is key. You have different kind of citizen identities. No, you have the people that are interested in participating because they are attention seeker, they are motivated activists, they are social volunteers. So you have to understand these kind of identities, to understand who are maybe the community leaders, because as Monica said in the comments, it's very important to find the right person in the right place in the right moment. So it's very, if you don't find this person, maybe the process can be completely terrible. So how to engage them, understanding before who they are, and then trying to engage and empower them in the process. So to give you a practical example, we made a project 5-7 years ago in Rome. It was a big park that we regenerated, and it was just because of one person, one key person. He was a person with a lot of personal problems with alcohol, and we understood that he was a leader for the community, and he was the key person to engage the others. So to find this person, Ivano, has been the key for the entire project. So, and he engaging him with empathy, with listening him, trying to keep every Saturday a meeting with him and eating together and doing some part of social engagement has been the key for the process. So for me, it's the first step is to identify leaders, to identify the key people in the right place. Thanks.
Thanks, Lisa. Yeah. I'm just wondering if it'd be interesting, I think, to go full circle actually. And it's been really great listening to everyone in the discussion. I'm just wondering if we can, and that maybe circling back to you to think about, from everything we've discussed, why it is that participation can be a key to achieving systems change and transformational change, and your thoughts on that.
Just a couple of reflections on that. So the first thing, I think we've been talking about a couple of distinct things, I think, certainly in the last part of this conversation. So one of them is participation as a tool for making, as a instrumental thing, as a tool for making other things better or more effective. And again, that's certainly true. You know, I think that the decisions made by local authorities, for example, will be better if there is a genuine degree of participation by citizens, and certainly the people who are affected by those decisions. That's almost certainly true. But that is participation in a sort of instrumental way. It's participation as a tool for something else to achieve its aims better. That's one thing. And I think the other thing is participation as being the thing that people do to make their lives better or more enjoyable or more connected or whatever it might be. In other words, it's not about participation to achieve something else's aims or objectives. It's participation as just the way of being, the way of doing, the way of living, really. And again, I'm not suggesting that one is more important than the other, but I truly believe that that if you think about all the different tools that we've got available to us to tackle the many challenges we have as communities, as cities, as societies over the next 10 years, if we fail to unlock, harness, enable the sort of ordinary things that people, the power of what ordinary people do in their everyday lives, we won't get anywhere near it, because we know that systems and institutions and organizations, no matter how well designed, can only go so far. And there's a huge amount of potential energy, creativity, ideas out there. Sometimes that idea can be sort of can be taken as being an excuse for small states, or for big societies, or whatever it might be. I don't intend it to be that at all. I think there's a really important role for institutions, the state, services, businesses, everything. But I just think that there's this vast missing part of the jigsaw that we need to harness. So I think we won't achieve what we need to achieve over the next 10 years unless we harness it and enable it.
And yeah, Karina, if you want to respond to that, I'm just thinking about, maybe from your perspective, it's sometimes more about influencing the kind of traditional power structures to embrace greater levels of sort of participatory methodologies and things like that. What are your thoughts?
Sorry, Nat, go ahead.
No, I think that was aimed at you, Karina, so I'll duck out.
Oh, I think from my perspective, the challenge is huge, and I would not underestimate how much we need to transform the very institutions and systems by which we develop and validate knowledge to actually be able to truly embrace participation. I think there's one thing saying, hey, people, come join our process, which we have already designed and it's already set up, and come play on our terms almost. And it's a very different thing to actually come at it with humility and say, let's try and understand how we reinvent, like how do we reimagine how we do things to begin with. And I think that is the danger here, especially, so again, bringing it to climate adaptation. So maybe not specific to everything, but there is the danger that we don't rightly value and rightly seek to integrate traditional knowledge, local knowledge, indigenous knowledge, and I think there's the danger of almost commodifying that and seeing it as things that you can put in boxes, that you can put in PDFs that can influence decisions. And I think the process of reimagining, how we know the world and what do we actually deem as knowledge. I think it's a huge process of decentering, centuries of Western ways of thinking and colonial ways of doing as well. So and I'm leaving this at the end because it's huge and it opens up a whole other conversation. So maybe maybe that's a good ending in suspense.
Dramatic pause. Sorry, I was trying to get myself off mute. Karina, definitely, we plenty more discussions to have around this. Just conscious of time, and we said we'd get some questions from the group, and I think we've been covering a lot of similar grounds actually to what a lot of the comments or the chat's been coming through. There's a question around how was it now? I think there was a question for Elisa in the chat around, I think maybe Elisa might want to take it, might not be, maybe someone else wants to take it, but it's a question really about balancing the power dynamics between facilitation and facilitators, participation and participants. Facilitation is power. It's a question from Joanne. Lisa, would you like to respond to that one?
That's a good question. If facilitation is power, yes, of course. I think it's a big power because you can guide the discussion, so you can guide the decision. So as Corina and Nat said, you need to have a culture also of facilitation, I think, because for interacting well and asking the good question, but also for choosing stakeholders, as we said. So the relation between the facilitator and stakeholder is the key relation, and also with decision and makers and politicians, because I saw this question also. That's a kind of facilitation that is different. It depends on the context and depends on the discussion the facilitation is moderating. But yes, facilitation for me it's power. So we have to create also a culture of facilitation to well manage participation in urban development.
Yeah, it's an interesting response come through from Johnny, I just saw in the chat, sort of asking about whether there's an idea of participation washing, a bit like greenwashing or something, where participation is minor or false, sort of false approach really, and only at the surface level, something which is done rather than taking a deeper community-based approach. I wonder if Nat, you've got some thoughts on that, because that must be something that you've come up against.
Yeah, I mean, I think I totally agree that it's a sort of it's a danger, but I think it's much more a danger when you imagine the idea of, I think this is what Elise was actually talking about, which is the idea of a process, which might be a process owned by something, an organization or an institution or something, and participation is introduced into that process simply to, in this sort of fairly superficial way, in order to make the process better or more effective or more legitimate. And that for me is a very different scenario. I think that totally creates the potential for participation washing. I think is a very interesting phrase, and I think it's profoundly different from genuinely saying, this organizations, institutions, power structures adopting a facilitative, enabling, infrastructural sort of mode in relation to citizens and residents, and saying, if we give you the tools to act and the resources and the connect and the support, what would you do? What things would you create? What would you want your neighborhoods to look like? What opportunities would you want to create for yourselves and your families? And I think it's very, very different, and it does require a different sort of framework of thinking about what power is for in our local authorities. But yeah, I totally agree that it's a danger.
Thanks, Nat. Just thinking about sort of final remarks really, and I'm sure there'll be a lot of people on this call who love the conversation and discussion so far, and maybe just thinking about what would be good things to do next if they're looking at encouraging participation within their local communities, or trying to speak to local government or policymakers about utilizing participatory approaches. Would you have advice for how they find out more, or what they might look to try? Open question to anyone.
Well, I'll just jump in. I would love anyone on this call to come and contact me at Participatory City Foundation. Come and visit us in Barking Dagenham. We run open. We run things called discovery days, where you can come and they're a bit like this. You can be in person or online and come and learn a bit more about what we do. But the other thing that I can talk very, very very happily about is all the things that we've learned where we didn't get it right, and where we're experimenting and trying to iterate and develop the way that we're thinking about our work. Yeah, I don't remotely want to describe or create the impression that what we've done in Biking Dagenham is some vision of perfection. It's not. It's been really messy, difficult, challenging work, but we're very proud of what we do. The one thing I would say in terms of the thing that has made all the difference, and again, probably not for this discussion, is a group of funders and a group of people around our project who have committed for a genuine, for me, unprecedented sort of commitment to 5 years. And in fact, now, because of COVID, that's been extended to nearly 8 years worth of commitment to building and testing something out at scale. And I think we need those with resources in terms of money, and those who are responsible for sort of getting things going in places, to commit and to be willing to live with a bit of mess and experimentation. Otherwise, we won't develop some of these approaches that are potentially could be the key to tackling these challenges we face.
Thanks, Nat. Karina, have you got thoughts or advice for people on the call listening in?
I guess my sort of thoughts would be around starting with the why, because I think sometimes it's almost like I see sometimes participation is also being used a bit as a nail, when all you have in your hand is a hammer. And I think is not always the right solution if you don't really know why do you want people to participate, and participate to do what, for what are they getting out of it, what are the value exchanges, what are the the value flows, how will you respect the knowledge and the time and the input that is being given. So I think thinking about these questions, almost like why participation, I think it can help us really in that, when we're opening processes and designing processes, to really kind of think, right, what is the right design, and when do we need to bring in participation? And I'm talking here not in, back to Nat's distinction between different meanings of participation. I'm talking here about participation as a process or as a tool to improve something. So if you're looking at decision making, if you're looking at governance, I think it's really important to really think about why and when in the process do you need participation. And I would say the other thing, the second thing that is really key, is not like once the sort of the timeline or the process is ended, not dropping off a cliff and disappearing. I think that is the most damaging thing that can happen to the trust that you build, to the relationships that you build. So it is a long-term commitment. So I think it's better not to do it than to do it really badly and to damage that potential for someone else to actually build relationships. So I think really kind of considering, right, am I building these relationships for a long term, or is it an in and out? Do I just need some data? So I think really thinking about the motivation, really thinking about the purpose, and what are you really inviting people to join in.
Thanks, Karina. Lisa, your thoughts?
Thanks, James. I really like the definition of participation of Monica. Let's say participation as a principle, recognizing and respecting the local knowledge, understanding the role of facilitators as enablers. It is leading to building flexible structure or platforms that will be evolving organically with people's need and co-create a solution. That's perfect, Monica. I think it really deals with it's a principle, it's a tool, it's an approach, but in fact it's a principle, it's an ethical principle. So it's related with ethics, with motivation, as Nat said. So it's for me, it's very important that to create this culture mainly, and it passed through the School of Architecture, the School of Facilitation, the School of, because I think we need more facilitator, but we need also more architect facilitator, urban planner facilitator, environmental expert facilitator, and so on. So it's a matter of culture, it's a matter of ethics, it's a matter of principle. So thank you very much, Monica. And thank you all.
Great, thanks, Lisa. That's a fantastic way to close our discussion. So we're just about run out of time. today. So thank you so much to all of our panelists in discussion, Nat, Karina, Elisa. Wonderful to have you with us. Super interesting discussion, and we've really benefited from your insights and experience. So thank you so much. There is a recording of this on YouTube, should you wish to watch back. We also have a couple more events coming up in our cities theme. The next one, again, will be on participatory cities. We're actually running a co-creation event on the 13th of April. Best thing to do is to have a look at the Systems Innovation events page on the website. You can also follow this bit.ly link, and you can sign up and join in with that as well. If you'd like to connect with any of us following this discussion, you'll be able to do so via systemsinnovation.network and find us on there. Thanks so much.